I'll never forget the moment I stepped through the carved double doors of Rebecca's parents' home that Thanksgiving evening. The warmth of the chandeliers spilled out across the marble floor, and every guest seemed to glitter in designer clothes that caught the light, like crystal. And then there was me, Linda Carter, 63 years old, wearing the best dress I could afford from a discount rack, clutching a small pumpkin pie I'd baked myself. The moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel it, the shift in the air, eyes moving over me, pausing just long enough to take note of everything I wasn't. I wish I could tell you it was my imagination, but it wasn't. I've lived long enough to recognize judgment when it's staring at me. Rebecca's mother barely glanced at the pie before setting it down next to silver trays filled with pastries that probably cost more than my entire Thanksgiving grocery budget. Rebecca herself floated across the room in silk, her hair perfectly arranged, her smile just wide enough to let me know I'd arrived late, underdressed, and at least in her eyes unworthy. Inside, I wanted to shrink, to disappear, to protect myself from the whispers I could already hear in the corners. A soft laugh muffled behind manicured hands. A sidelong glance from one of Rebecca's cousins. They didn't have to say the words out loud. The message was clear enough. I wasn't one of them. I never would be. What hurt most wasn't their glances or the way Rebecca leaned into my son Mark, pretending not to notice the tension. What hurt was knowing he didn't speak up. He looked at me once, almost apologetically, then turned back to her world like he belonged there more than he belonged. With me, I told myself not to take it personally, that he was caught in the middle. But deep down, I could feel the familiar sting of being placed on the outside of my own son's life. The dinner hadn't even begun, and already my chest felt heavy. Every clink of a glass, every burst of laughter around that polished table only made me more aware of my wrinkled dress and my secondhand shoes. I sat quietly at the edge, trying to steady myself with deep breaths, reminding myself that I'd survived much worse than a cold shoulder at a dinner party. Still, the humiliation pressed in. It was the way Rebecca leaned close to her aunt and whispered with her eyes fixed on me. The way the polished silver seemed to reflect back an image I barely recognized, an aging woman who didn't belong in their world of glossy perfection. But I kept my back straight. I forced my hands to stay steady in my lap. Because if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that dignity doesn't always come from the way people see you. Sometimes it comes from refusing to crumble when they want you to. I told myself I'd get through the evening quietly, the way I always had. I'd swallow the shame and hold my head high, even if my heart felt small. But as I sat there, surrounded by crystal and candlelight, I couldn't help but wonder, how did my life bring me to this? How had I gone from raising my son with love and sacrifice to being treated like an afterthought at his family table? And that's when I knew I had to tell this story from the beginning. Because the truth of how I ended up at that Thanksgiving dinner feeling invisible, humiliated, yet holding on to my dignity starts long before I walked through those doors. It starts with the life I built, the struggles I endured, and the choices that shaped me into the woman I am. After sitting there at that polished table, feeling small in a world that never seemed to want me, I couldn't help but think back to where it all began. Because the truth is, my life wasn't always defined by awkward silences and judgmental stares. For most of it, I built a life out of love, hard work, and quiet perseverance. I grew up believing that if you worked hard and treated people with kindness, you would be respected. And for many years, that was true. When my husband Tom was alive, we lived a simple but full life. We had a little house with peeling paint on the porch, a garden out back where I grew tomatoes every summer, and a living room that always smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. It wasn't much compared to the estates Rebecca's family takes for granted. But it was ours, and it was happy. When Tom passed away 12 years ago, everything shifted. His death left a hole I didn't know how to fill. The pension he left behind kept me afloat, but it was just enough to pay the bills and keep food on the table. Luxuries were out of the question. I learned how to stretch every dollar, how to mend clothes instead of replacing them, how to make casseroles that lasted 3 days. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror and shopped at thrift stores. None of it embarrassed me. It was survival, and I was proud of my ability to manage. Raising Mark had been my greatest joy and also my greatest challenge. I worked double shifts when he was in high school just so he could have money for sports equipment and the chance to apply to college without worrying. I went without new shoes so he could go to prom in a suit that actually fit. Every decision I made was about giving him the life Tom and I had always dreamed for him. And for a while, I thought that sacrifice was enough. Mark made it. He became successful, respected, and found himself drawn into a world I could never quite reach. When he met Rebecca, I knew instantly that she came from a different universe. The first time she walked into my apartment, her eyes darted around at the secondhand furniture and mismatched plates, and I could almost hear the thoughts she didn't say out loud. She was polite, but there was something in her smile that felt like pity disguised as kindness. The truth is, I wanted her to like me. I wanted so badly to be accepted, not just for myself, but because she was now part of my son's life. I tried, I really did. I baked pies. I asked questions about her work. I even went to a charity gala once, though I felt out of place the entire night. Still, nothing I did seemed to change her opinion. In her eyes, I was always Mark's mother from another world. Someone tolerated but never truly welcomed. It's hard to describe the quiet ache of being sidelined in your own son's life. Phone calls that get shorter over time. Invitations that only come for obligatory holidays. Dinners where you sit at the far end of the table, listening to conversations about stock portfolios, ski trips, and designer renovations you can't contribute to. It's like being in the room but not really being seen. I've spent years reminding myself that I did my part, that my worth isn't defined by their approval, and yet, I would be lying if I said it didn't sting every time I saw Rebecca look at me, with that faint smirk, as if my thrift store clothes told her everything she needed to know. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Sometimes the moments that seem small, a choice to stop, to help, to care become the very moments that shift everything. I didn't know it then. But the woman who felt invisible at her own family's Thanksgiving dinner was about to be seen in a way she never imagined. Because before that night was over, one simple act of kindness would change the way Rebecca's family looked at me. Forever. And it all began on the drive over to that dinner. The drive to Rebecca's parents' estate that evening was already enough to make my nerves fray. The November air had turned sharp. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones even inside a heated car. My wipers fought against sleet that seemed determined to blind me, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. I kept rehearsing in my mind how I'd smile when I walked in, how I'd try not to embarrass Mark, how I'd do my best to fit into a world that never really wanted me. That's when I saw him. Just off the shoulder of the winding road, hazard lights flickering faintly in the storm, stood an older man beside a dark sedan with its hood propped open. He was bundled in a heavy coat but no gloves, no hat. His breath visible in the air as he leaned over the engine. Cars zipped by cautiously, but no one stopped. I slowed as I passed, torn in that instant. I was already running behind, already nervous about facing Rebecca's family. I had worked hard to look presentable, to keep my hair neat. to make sure my dress didn't wrinkle on the drive. If I stopped now, all of that would be gone. But how could I not? Something inside me wouldn't let me drive past. Maybe it was the years of Tom teaching me the basics of car maintenance in our driveway, his hands greasy, mine small but eager to learn. Maybe it was just the simple knowledge of what it feels like to be stranded. Invisible, hoping someone will care enough to help. Whatever it was, I pulled over, rolled down the window, and called out. His face was lined, his eyes sharp, but his shoulders slumped with the weight of the situation. I got out, immediately feeling the icy rain soak through my coat. My carefully styled hair clung to my forehead within minutes. My shoes slipped on the frozen pavement, and I caught myself on the hood. I checked the battery connections, remembering Tom's lessons. The corrosion was obvious. I rummaged in my car for a small bottle of soda I kept for long drives and poured it over the terminals, scrubbing with my keys until the green film loosened. It was messy, it was ridiculous, and I knew my dress was ruined. But when the engine finally roared back to life, the look of relief on that man's face made every sacrifice worth it. By the time I got back in my car, my coat was dripping, my dress stained, and my hands shaking from the cold. I glanced in the mirror at my reflection and barely recognized myself. Whatever effort I had put into blending in at that dinner was gone. I drove on anyway, heart heavy with dread. When I arrived, the valet looked at my car with thinly veiled disdain, then at me, soaked and bedraggled. Inside, the warmth of the estate only magnified my disheveled state. Crystal chandeliers illuminated every flaw, the frizz in my hair, the damp lines on my dress, the mud on my shoes. Conversations faltered as people turned to look. The whispers started immediately, cutting through the air sharper than the wind outside. Rebecca's eyes widened when she saw me, and then narrowed, her smile tightening into something polite but cruel. She leaned toward Mark, her hand brushing his arm as if to shield him from the embarrassment of my presence. I wanted to disappear. Every judgmental glance, every muffled laugh, pressed down on me until my chest ached. I had walked into my worst fear, being not just overlooked, but ridiculed. And then, just as I was preparing myself to endure the evening in silence, the room shifted. The doors opened, and in walked the very man I had just helped on the side of the road. His coat was still damp, his hair still dusted with sleet, but his presence seemed to command attention immediately. Guests straightened in their seats, conversations hushed. Rebecca's father hurried forward with respect in his voice, calling him Dad. That's when it hit me. The man I had helped with corroded battery terminals in the freezing rain was none other than Henry Wallace, Rebecca's grandfather, the patriarch of the family, the figure everyone deferred to in hushed tones. And he had just spotted me across the room? His sharp blue eyes locked on mine, recognition sparking instantly. The whispers around me faltered, confusion rippling through the guests as Henry began to move toward me with deliberate steps. My heart pounded. In that moment, humiliation turned to shock, and I knew something was about to happen that no one in that room could have predicted. The room went silent as Henry Wallace walked toward me. His shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, each step pulling the air tighter, the whispers dying in his wake. I stood there, soaked and shivering, feeling like a schoolgirl caught out of place. Every instinct told me to shrink back, to apologize for taking up space. But Henry's eyes never wavered. They were sharp, knowing, and filled with something I hadn't expected: respect. He stopped in front of me, glanced at my ruined dress, and then turned to face the rest of the room. His voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the silence. He told them exactly why I looked the way I did, because while everyone else was sitting in comfort, I had stopped in the freezing rain to help a stranger. That stranger was him. I swear, I felt the temperature in the room shift. The whispers turned into stunned silence. And suddenly, every pair of eyes was on me for a reason I hadn't known in years. Not ridicule, but disbelief. Rebecca's mother pressed her lips together, her glass of wine trembling slightly in her hand. Rebecca herself looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Mark's face flushed, caught between pride and fear. Henry wasn't finished. He went on, his words slicing through the polished air of that grand room. He said it wasn't just the act of kindness that mattered, it was the willingness to sacrifice appearance and comfort to do what was right. He asked them how many in that room would have stopped. How many would have risked mud on their shoes or stains on their designer gowns to help someone stranded in the cold? No one answered. Of course, no one answered. The silence was the answer. And then came the moment that stunned me most. Henry revealed something none of them had ever dared to say out loud. He reminded them all that the Wallace name, the company they paraded as a symbol of privilege, hadn't been built by the man standing smugly at his side, Rebecca's father. No, it had been built by Henry himself, brick by brick, deal by deal, long before country clubs and gated estates entered the picture. The shock rippled through the room. Rebecca's father stiffened, his jaw tightening as if holding back words he couldn't afford to say. Rebecca's mother tried to smile, to brush it off with a dismissive laugh. But Henry's gaze pinned her in place. He told them the truth that the empire they took for granted was rooted in sweat, sacrifice, and values they seemed to have long forgotten. And then, to my astonishment, he looked back at me. He told them that in me, he saw the very spirit that had once built this family's legacy. That my resourcefulness, my refusal to walk past someone in need, was the kind of strength that mattered more than expensive dresses or polished appearances. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a burden, not as a poor widow trying to keep up, but as a woman of worth. I saw Mark's eyes glisten as he looked at me, truly looked at me. Rebecca, on the other hand, couldn't mask her fury. Her lips pressed thin, her hands balled into fists at her side. This wasn't how she'd planned the evening. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Rebecca's father finally spoke, his voice polite but icy, suggesting that perhaps Henry was exaggerating. Henry silenced him with nothing more than a raised hand and a look that brooked no argument. Age hadn't dulled his authority. If anything, it had sharpened it. I stood there, trembling in the middle of that glittering parlor, my wet shoes dripping on their Persian rug, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: vindication. Years of subtle snubs and whispered dismissals had led to this moment, where the most powerful voice in that family chose to defend me, to hold me up as an example rather than an embarrassment. As the conversations resumed in hushed tones and the tension lingered like smoke, I found myself almost lightheaded. How had I gone from dreading humiliation to being publicly defended by the very man who defined that family's name? It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's story, but it was mine. For the first time in years, it was truly mine. And I had no idea that Henry was only getting started. Just when I thought the evening had reached its peak of surprises, Henry did something that left me completely speechless. The room had begun to recover from his earlier revelation. People whispering in corners, trying to make sense of what he'd said. And then, without warning, he turned back to me and spoke words I never imagined hearing. He said he wanted me to work with him. At first, I thought I'd misheard. Me, Linda Carter, a widow living on a pension, someone who shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons he wanted me to join. His company as a consultant? For a moment, my mind scrambled, searching for a reason, for some logical explanation. I had no business background, no resume that would impress anyone in that room. I opened my mouth to protest, but Henry raised his hand gently, as if he already knew what I was about to say. He explained that it wasn't about titles or credentials. It was about values real, human values that had gone missing somewhere along the way. He told everyone that businesses, like families, only survive when they remember the people at the heart of them. And he believed I had something his company needed: honesty, compassion, and the ability to see beyond appearances. The shock on Rebecca's face was almost painful to watch. Her father's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tight with restrained anger. Rebecca's mother shifted uncomfortably, her wine glass trembling in her hand. For them, it was unthinkable. For me, it was overwhelming. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to shrink into the floor and disappear all at once. I shook my head slightly, stammering that I didn't know the first thing about corporate consulting. But Henry only smiled, calm and steady, and said that what I carried with me couldn't be taught in a classroom. That character, once lost, was far harder to replace than skills. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. For years, I had bent myself into silence, trying not to embarrass Mark, trying to earn even a sliver of Rebecca's approval. I had accepted humiliation as my place in their world. But now, here was the patriarch of the family acknowledging me, valuing me, lifting me higher than I ever dreamed possible. I looked over at Mark, unsure of what I would find in his eyes. For the first time in years, I saw not just worry or guilt, but pride. His gaze lingered on me, soft but steady, as if he was finally seeing his mother, not as someone who needed protecting, but as someone worth respecting. That look alone was worth more than anything else that night. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and said yes. My voice was quiet but sure. The kind of answer that comes from deep inside when you know it's time to stop. Shrinking. The room buzzed with disbelief. I could feel Rebecca's fury from across the table, her father's cold stare burning into me. But none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't standing on the outside of their world. I was stepping into my own new chapter. Henry nodded, satisfied, and patted my shoulder gently. It was his way of telling me that this was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. That night, in the very place I thought I would be humiliated beyond repair, I found something I hadn't expected: not just acceptance, but purpose. And that's when I realized the night wasn't really about me being judged. It was about me rediscovering who I truly was. Looking back on that night, it still amazes me how quickly life can change. I walked into that house certain I was about to endure another round of humiliation. Another evening of being treated like an outsider in my own son's world. And yet, by the time I left, everything had shifted. It all began with one choice to stop on the side of the road and help a stranger in the cold. I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it for reward. I did it because that's how I was raised. Because Tom always taught me that character is measured in the small decisions no one else sees. That single act of kindness, one I nearly talked myself out of, became the very thing that opened a new chapter in my life. And it taught me something important. Wealth isn't the clothes you wear or the cars parked in your driveway. It isn't the way others measure your worth at a dinner table. True wealth is found in the way you treat people, in the compassion you offer, in the courage to put kindness before appearances. That night, I thought my ruined dress and muddy shoes marked the end of my dignity. Instead, they became the symbols of my vindication. Because sometimes, what feels like your lowest moment is really the stage being set for your greatest redemption. I found myself walking out of that mansion not just accepted, but with a purpose I never imagined. And more than anything, I left with my son looking at me differently finally, with the respect I had longed for, not because I tried to fit in, but because I stayed true to who I am. So, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever sat in a room where people dismissed you or looked right past you, I want you to remember this. Your worth is not decided by them. It's decided by the choices you make when no one's watching, by the kindness you show and the integrity you carry. And if my story touched you, I'd love for you to share yours. Leave a comment, let others know they're not alone in feeling overlooked. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like and share it, because sometimes the simplest reminder of dignity and kindness can be exactly what someone else needs to hear.